Vladimir Putin has his eye on the reconstruction of the Russian Empire. You already know that for him, Moscow was the victim of a kind of geopolitical trick and deception provoked by the West following the fall of the Soviet Union with the intention of annihilating its power and influence. This is something the Kremlin now has to fix. Even so, it's not that simple. In Ukraine, Putin has barely managed to add some 100,000 square kilometers to his new empire. That may sound like a lot, but it's barely 0.6% of Russia's area. Be that as it may, the issue of Russian borders may soon be put on the back burner, because these days, Mother Russia has a much more pressing problem.
Russia's birth rate plunges to 200-year low. According to demographer Alexei Raksha, the first quarter of 2025 likely saw the lowest number of births since the early 1800s, with February marking the lowest monthly figure in over 200 years. Putin urges Russians to have more kids, says ethnic survival at stake.
The falling birth rate is certainly a global problem, but Russia is below average on almost all indicators of demographic development. Vladimir Putin does not want, and it's probably not even feasible, to build an empty empire, so he's sparing no expense in this matter. In recent weeks, the Kremlin has announced an investment of $790 million to boost the birth rate. And let's see, at first glance, it may not seem like a lot of money, but keep in mind that we're talking about a country currently at war and with a huge budget gap. That they are considering these things at a time like this tells us a lot about how important this is to them. In fact, it's an issue that the Russian government has called nothing less than life and death for the development and expansion of the motherland.
Russian cities are littered with giant billboards asking women to get their act together to give birth as soon as possible. This is what the Russian government considers the duty of Russian women.
Make sure that Russia has a brighter future. We need to have more Russians. I'm talking, of course, about the increasing number of families with multiple children.
Let's be clear. Talking about demographics in Russia essentially means talking about a deep-seated crisis that is now becoming more and more visible. Among other reasons, because this country has lost tens of thousands of men on the Ukrainian front, while its fertility rate has plummeted to historic lows. And if we add to this the fact that since 2022, about 750,000 people have left the country, the conclusion is clear. The pace of emptying is a critical hiccup for Putin's imperial plans. And remember, it's not just us saying this. This is basically what Vladimir Putin himself is repeating. But what plans does the Kremlin have to reverse this population tragedy? What is behind Russia's plummeting birth rate? What implications do war and economic stagnation have for this problem? To what extent does all this inconvenience Putin's imperial plans? Well, today we're going to talk about all this and more. Stay tuned. But before we continue, let me ask you something. Have you heard of the 14 Eyes Alliance? It's an international agreement between countries like the US, UK, Canada, Germany, and others, allowing their governments to collect and share internet user data with each other. In simple terms, your online activity can be monitored without your knowledge and potentially used against you. So, is there a way to avoid this kind of surveillance? Yes, by using a VPN, but not just any VPN. You need one that's reliable, secure, and based outside the 14 Eyes Alliance. That's where CyberGhost VPN comes in. CyberGhost is the ultimate tool for protecting your privacy online, not just from governments, but also from hackers and cybercriminals. It's headquartered outside the 14 Eyes countries, and unlike many VPNs, it actually keeps no logs of your activity. So just open CyberGhost VPN before you browse, and no one will be able to track your online activity. You get full privacy. It's fast, it's super easy to use, it's trusted by over 38 million users, and has an excellent rating on Trustpilot. Plus, it blocks ads and malware, while still giving you all the classic VPN perks, like bypassing geo-restrictions on streaming platforms or accessing websites blocked by governments. And here's the best part. By using the link in the description, you are getting a special offer. It's just €2.03 a month, and you can connect up to 7 devices. If you share your account with friends or family, that's basically 30 cents per person for full online privacy. That's not bad for less than the price of a coffee, right? If you want to try CyberGhost and support our channel at the same time, we'd really appreciate it. Just use the QR code on the screen or the link in the description, and don't worry, there is a 45-day money-back guarantee. So if it's not for you, no problem. You've got nothing to lose by giving it a shot. Just scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below. During the second half of the 20th century, more than 400,000 Soviet women were decorated with the title of Mother Heroine, an award created by Joseph Stalin himself at the end of 1944 to reward all those mothers who provided the Soviet Union with 10 births. At the time, Moscow was urgently looking for a way to compensate for the millions of casualties the country suffered during World War II. Be that as it may, this odd way that the Soviet homeland had to honor its mothers disappeared with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1992. That is, until 30 years later, in 2022, when Vladimir Putin revived it.
Vladimir Putin to award 1 million rubles to hero mothers who have 10 or more children. Under the decree, eligible mothers will receive a one-time payment of 1 million rubles, equivalent to $16,000, when their 10th living child turns 1.
The return of the heroine mothers to modern Russia tells us a lot about the critical moment this country's demographics are going through. And while in general this is a widespread problem among countries around the world, Russia's situation is among the worst. Take a look.
By the mid-1980s, Russia reported a fertility rate far higher than that of the major European countries, even surpassing that of the United States. However, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, along with the ensuing economic and political crisis, marked the beginning of a long decline. And so, during the second decade of the 21st century, fertility data in Russia was on par with that of most developed countries. However, now all sources reveal a massive drop following the invasion of Ukraine.
Fertility rates in Russia have fallen to 1.4 children per woman, while in some major cities there is barely one birth per woman. This is far below the replacement fertility rate, which is usually calculated at 2.1. And if we take into account the consequences of the war, you can imagine the result. In 2024, overall, 500,000 more deaths than births were registered in Russia. However, if we're talking about demographics in Russia, we have to take into account three aspects that are often overlooked. Let's see. We all know that Putin is, in social terms, a staunch conservative, and supposedly a staunch defender of the traditional family. So, as a result, his diagnosis is largely based on the thinking that women, having changed their social and economic expectations, are no longer as committed to Mother Russia. But do you know what? It's probably better if you listen to his own words.
First, a young woman wants to get an education, then a postgraduate degree, then take the first steps in the career. This is called postponing the first child. For the second child, there is neither strength nor time to ensure the growth of the family. Population should be formed at an earlier age.
What Putin forgets is that his government is also not making it any easier for women, in a country that is even experiencing a growing crisis of domestic violence. And the thing is, in 2017, the Russian legislature pushed for the decriminalization of several crimes related to violence against women, or so-called intra-family violent acts. For example, in those cases where the physical aggression does not leave serious damage or is systematic, the punishment is a simple fine, equivalent to that of a traffic infraction. And we're talking about a country where an estimated 12,000 women die each year as a result of this type of violence, and where less than half of the victims dare to denounce their aggressors precisely because of the laxity of the law. On top of all this, we have to add the serious problems that the Russian population continues to suffer, a country that is, by far, one of the highest consumers of alcohol per capita in the world, which, logically, has a lot of social consequences, among them many more cases of domestic violence. And if the situation was already critical, since the invasion of Ukraine was launched, things have gone from bad to worse.
Russia faces spike in crime and alcoholism as war nears 2-year mark. Rosstat noted a rapidly growing number of patients suffering from alcoholism and alcoholic psychosis.
And that's not all. Since 2022, many serious cases of violence against women have ended in commutations of sentences for the accused in exchange for their enlistment in the Russian armed forces. The result of all these changes? Russia is not exactly a particularly women-friendly country. And for many experts, this situation of increasing vulnerability is related precisely to the drop in Russian women's appetite for starting new families. But let's continue. Putin longs for a great Russian empire. For Russians, the problem is that his definition of Russians is increasingly restrictive. The 21st century Tsar is obsessed with ethnic survival. The campaign to promote the birth rate is quite generous in economic terms, but it's aimed mainly at urban centers, where the population of ethnically Russian origin is more numerous. And here, VisualPolitik community, we need to remember that Russia is a nation of nations.
Russia is a country composed of Slavic Russians, who are considered ethnic Russians, but also millions of Tatars, Bashkirs, Chuvash, Chechens, and many other groups with their own identities.
In fact, in rural areas and among the non-Slavic population, the birth rate is much higher. The problem is that this is not the birth rate that Moscow wants. Among other reasons, because the non-Russian population already accounts for 30%, and in the Kremlin, there is fear that in a few decades, the Slavs will not even be a majority in a country that will be increasingly Muslim.
1/3 of Russia will be Muslim within 15 years, Grand Mufti predicts.
Put another way, if Russia's demographic problem is already significant, the problem of the Slavic population, which is of most concern to the Kremlin, is much greater. But let's go on. The fall in births is a general problem throughout the West, although in other countries there is one factor that helps to mitigate its consequences, at least for now. I am talking, of course, about immigration. And not surprisingly, in this respect, the situation in the Kremlin is also in trouble. Look at this.
After the dissolution of the USSR, Russia reported negative migration. That is, more people began leaving the country than were entering. However, between 1995 and 2004, several schemes financed with oil money to encourage a return to a much more stable motherland achieved some results. Even so, the results were limited.
As you can probably imagine, Putin's Russia is not a destination that springs to mind when a person thinks about emigrating. Most of its immigrants come from Central Asian countries. So what's the problem? Well, after the terrorist attack on the Crocus City Hall concert hall in Moscow in March 2024, the Russian government launched a witch hunt. The result? Russia deported more than 80,000 foreigners, almost double the 2023 records, which naturally has further spurred demographic problems. Problems that are becoming a dead end for a country that is consuming its resources in war and that has not known prosperity for years. In other words, for a country that has the same problems, or even worse than those of developed countries, but without having their resources. That is why Putin is so obsessed.
We have to take care of the people, increase the birth rate, create conditions for people to form large families, to make it viable to have many children, like in the old days in the USSR when families had 9 or 10 children.
It seems that the empire that this neo-czar has in mind works more in his mind than in real life. And to top it all off, there's this other problem.
Life expectancy in Russia is one of its greatest contemporary failures. In Europe, the United States, and even China, people live 5 to 10 years longer. However, Moscow's record is very poor, even in contrast to other, much less developed regions, such as Latin America. Indicators on alcoholism, heart disease, and smoking are extremely high in Russia.
And then, on top of all that, while Putin is spending money on war, he hasn't been able to promote a healthcare system that is capable of meeting minimum standards. Essentially, healthcare in Russia is an urban luxury. Obviously, all this has another very significant consequence. And experts are saying that, if current demographic indicators continue, the last great wave of military-age men will disappear in 12 to 15 years. In other words, that Putin's widespread compulsory military service scheme has its days numbered. So this is how things stand in the country, facing a particularly intense demographic crisis, which in itself could be a huge one given its enormous ambitions. But having said that, this is a more or less widespread problem. So the question is, how would you fix it? What action would you take? Leave us your ideas in the comments and let's get the discussion rolling. And once again, a big thank you to CyberGhost for sponsoring this video. For just €2.03 a month, you get full protection for your data and unrestricted access to blocked content around the world. Remember, you can try it completely risk-free thanks to their 45-day money-back guarantee. And by signing up, you're also helping support our content. And very important, if you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. Take care. See you soon.